What's up, gamers? Your girl had a doctor's appointment, and so I'm not at school today. However, we are on a little bit of a tight schedule in this unit, and we don't have time to fiddle-faddle around. So we need to take some notes today, and I figured the best way to do that would be like this. I know that this is not anyone's favorite way to take notes, but sometimes it'd be like that. So, today, Today we're going to be continuing to work in Module 22. We talked a little bit about growth rate and doubling time and all that on Friday, but today we need to get into fertility rate and some more population dynamic stuff. Okay, so this is a little more of the theoretical side. If you remember on Friday, I complained a little bit about the math side. This is the stuff that's going to be more directly relevant to you and your exam. So, there are a lot of things we can measure about a population and a lot of different factors that influence a population that are not just like crude birth, crude death. So there's more to that, okay? So one of the things we can talk about in a population is fertility. Okay, so we can measure the total fertility rate, which is an estimate of how many children a woman is going to have in her lifetime. Through her childbearing years, rather, okay? So, in the U.S., our total fertility rate is about 1.8 children, and again, it's a little weird when you're getting into population math because you can't have 0.8 children, but it's an average. What are you going to do? So, on average, a woman in the U.S. can expect to have 1 to 2 children, which seems pretty normal. There are a lot of different factors that affect fertility rates. We tend to focus very heavily on, U.S. and very U.S.-centric, but we have to realize that we're talking about global fertility here as well. So there's lots of things that can affect how many children a woman will have throughout her childbearing years, the first of which is the age at which she first gets pregnant. So typically the earlier you get pregnant in your life, the more babies you will have. And, we can all kind of, giggle behind our hands thinking about teen pregnancy and stuff like that. But honestly, that is the truth. Statistically, if you get pregnant when you are very young, you are more likely to have more children throughout your life. And again, we're not just talking about the U.S. here, we're talking about everywhere. So, another factor that is going to affect fertility rates is education. Typically, the less educated you are, the more children you will have. And there's a lot of different things that, factor into that. You can talk about, sex education. People that are less educated in that particular, aspect are definitely going to have more kids. But you can also just look at, college education. It's not super uncommon that me, a 28-year-old person with a college education, doesn't have a kid. That's not weird, really. It's not really that weird that Dr. Howard, with her doctorate, waited until she was 30 to have her first kid. And it's also not really weird that, one of my classmates who graduated high school and that was the highest her education went, she has 3 kids by now, So, on average, the more educated you are, the less children you will have in your life, and the later you will wait to have those children. And again, this is just averages. Obviously, there's going to be, stuff that defies the average. But, oh, my light just went off. Let me turn that back on. This is scary. Right in here. I promise. There we go. Okay. So, another thing that affects fertility is the right to own property. Are women allowed to own property? The status of a woman really impacts how many kids she will have. If a woman is able to be her own independent person, she's going to have a lot more autonomy, and she's not just a baby factory. So, again, right to work. How much autonomy does that woman have? What age is that woman getting married? Are you supposed to get married when you're 12? That's going to affect how many babies you have because you're going to start reproducing as soon as you hit puberty. Versus here in the U.S. we have an age where you can't be married or you can't have, sex supposed to before that age. So, you're not really supposed to engage in sexual congress before you're 14 or something. It becomes rape at that point. So, At what age are you able to get married? Are you even able to get divorced? And what rights does an unmarried woman have? So again, status of the woman. The higher the status of a woman in society, the less kids she's likely to have. Okay, so we're thinking of like, here in the US where mostly males and females are going to be, well, legally, males and females are equal, versus places like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, where women can get married at age 12 and they can't own property and they're kind of just beholden to their husband their whole life, and they're basically just a baby factory. So, also, views on family planning and structure. Are you allowed to do family planning? Are you allowed to say, I don't want to have a baby this year, so we're going to use condoms and birth control? Like, are you allowed to do that? A lot of places on earth, you're not allowed to do that. And also government acts and policies. Are you allowed access to family planning material? Are you allowed access to abortions? Are you allowed access to adoption agencies? Stuff like that. So, lots of things affect the fertility rates. The number one thing, though, is going to be status of women. Like, all of these tie back to the status of women. Moving on. Sorry, that was super long-winded. So here's a graph showing the fertility rates, total fertility rates, on our planet. So again, here in the US, we're just below 1. We'll talk here in a second about what that means. But you can see in a lot of places where statistically women are less likely to have many rights. So over here in Africa and in the Middle East, you have much higher fertility rates. Okay, so in some places in Africa, women are going to be having anywhere from 6 to 8 babies, and that's normal. And there's a lot of different things that can cause that, again, but one of the major things is women's rights. Are women equal members of society? So, with fertility, we have another thing called replacement fertility rate. Okay, so this is your total fertility rate that is required to offset the death of the parents. It should be 2. So me and my husband should have 2 kids to replace me and my husband when we die. Okay, so replacement fertility rate, the goal is 2 to maintain a stable population. Ideally, it should be about 2.1 to account for, random death and stuff like that, but it'd be like that. So in developed countries, you're going to see a total fertility rate, or replacement fertility rate, around 2. Okay, that's normal. However, in developing countries, you are going to see a total fertility rate of much greater than 2. And again, like what we just saw on the graph before, where you have like 7 or 8 babies, okay? Now, real quick before we move on, it is no longer appropriate to use the terms first world country and third world country. Now we say developing and developed. So we live in a developed country, and a developing country is one that is characterized by having really low industrialization. So we're still doing a lot of hand-to-mouth farming. And on average, you have a daily income of less than $3 US. Okay, so that is how we in the U.S. define a developing country. Obviously, this is going to change a little bit depending on where you are, but as a developed country, this is what we say. Just because it's a little demeaning to call something a first world country, and also there's like second world country, it just is weird. So there's places that have, high levels of industrialization, but they don't meet this daily income requirement. So we would still categorize them as developing, whereas that wouldn't be a first world country anymore, and it just becomes really confusing. And also it's kind of demeaning. So we don't use the terms like first world and third world anymore. We use developed and developing. Okay, so another metric we can take in populations is life expectancy, which, as you can tell by the name, is how long are you expected to live in your country. So you can report that as total life expectancy, male only or female only. Sometimes it's useful if there's something crazy going on. We'll look at some graphs where populations are heavily male-centered, and so their life expectancy as a total population is weird because on average men don't live as long as women. I think women live like 2 more years on average than men do, just because men are more likely to have heart problems. But again, you can see the life expectancy on our planet. And again, in a lot of these places where women don't have a lot of rights and maybe we are still in a developing area, the life expectancy is going to be a lot lower. This is going to be to food inequality and food scarcity, and like poor medicine and stuff like that, okay? But over in developed countries, you can see that our life expectancy is relatively high, okay? So we can expect to live about 70 years on average, okay? So the, I believe, final metric that we can talk about in a population is youth mortality. So you can divide that up between infant and child. Infant mortality is the number of deaths per children that are under 1 year. And again, we scale that for 1,000, just like we did with crude birth and crude death. So child mortality is a little different. It's kids that are between 1 and 5. So typically, if your infant dies, it is because of a lack of sanitation or medical care. Child mortality can also be lack of sanitation or medical care, but it also could be food insecurity, or you live in a dangerous place, or things like that. So the cause for these two things is a little bit different. So we're mostly going to be focusing on infant mortality because it directly ties to status of women, medicine, and healthcare availability. Now, it's crazy to me, here in the US, we have an ungodly high infant mortality rate. Like, that is insane. Like, we should be way down here with like Italy and France and other developed places. But we're way down here, and this is really embarrassing for us. Also, infant mortality, unfortunately, varies greatly depending on the race. Okay, so I'm going to move myself over here so we can see the depressing right here. So this is a graph showing infant mortality rates in the US. So our national average is about 6. Okay, I would sit down here in this 4.8. Unfortunately, American Indians are almost double what white Americans are experiencing with infant mortality, and then African Americans are almost triple. And unfortunately, this is mostly going to be due to institutionalized racism. It just be like that. I know that it's not a cool and fun thing to talk about, but when you forcibly push a community down and make sure that they can't rise up, things like this happen. Also, I'm convinced that this huge graph over here is probably also due to medical suspicion, which, like, medicine and the scientific community have not been super great to the African American community, what with all of the experimentation on them with like Tuskegee and all that. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that, African Americans have much higher infant mortality rates because they are marginalized and forcibly, impoverished, and like, yikes. So, it's very unfortunate, but it's not entirely surprising. So, weirdly enough, even if a country has a really low infant mortality rate and a really high life expectancy, they can still have a pretty high crude death, which means it's just because there's a lot of old people around that are able to die. So diseases can also skew your crude death rate pretty wildly. So we have, weird anomalies where HIV disproportionately affects people in the middle age. So middle age has, a weirdly high death rate as we move from the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whenever HIV was a big thing. So that age group has a weird death rate because of that. Also, so you can see over here in the US and Mexico, we have a higher life expectancy and a lower infant mortality rate, but we have a much higher death rate than Mexico. And it's just because we have a lot more old people around to die. Okay, so the US has a crude death rate of 8 for 1,000 and Mexico has 5. Okay, it's just because we have a much higher population of old people. So statistically, our numbers are going to look worse. So all of this is, very much a grain of salt. Okay. Ooh, how much do I have? Oh, last one. Okay. So another thing we can look at is net migration, and that is your difference between immigrants and emigrants. So we have a total fertility rate of 1.8. We should be decreasing in population because we're not replacing our, dead, but we do have a net immigration of 3. So our national population is growing really heavily because these numbers are affecting our total growth. Okay, so Those are just some different metrics that we can look at in a population and different things that we can talk about a population with. I'm out of time, but we'll come back tomorrow and talk about age structure diagrams, which are really interesting.